As I get older, you always grew up listening to people talking about watching their back or lifting with their hips as you proceeded to not do any of that. And then you get older and you go, wait a minute, I remember this. They were onto something. No joke to be doing a jackhammer like that. So well done, Simon. But no, on that problem, like you're saying, alchemizing conversation and all these different things. I've been very interested too, a kind of phrase, just kind of based on what Simon was saying. There's the famous idea from Wittgenstein that the limits of my language are the limits of my world. But it's very interesting because I actually think you could add something to that where the limits of my body are the limits of my language, which are the limits of my world, actually, where the body actually conditions language and language conditions the world. But I actually think it also goes the other way. The limits of my world are the limits of my language, which are the limits of my body. And I like adding the body part because I think it completes the feedback loop. And one of the reasons I say that, Joel, who I love, he wrote a natural theologian. He also wrote some tremendous work on a man named Sol Kripke, whose name I always struggle with. But Kripke is a famous kind of language philosopher, bringing together Wittgenstein and different people. And one of the things he kind of points out, he's really critiquing all of the ideas that words are just like definitions. Like when we talk, we have definitions in mind that we communicate, and that it's all based on gathering information and ideas, and that you can kind of separate language from the world, right? Because you had this kind of movement going to some formal system ideas. Obviously, Goethe deconstructed a lot of that, but that idea that, ideas can be in language, if we can really get to what language is, we can actually get at, you could eat everything, basically, truth, meaning, becomes a kind of Borges alpha, maybe, in that story where we can see everything by. But, Kripke makes this kind of point, and he has a more elaborate way of putting it. But basically, what ends up happening is when I use the word donkey, I'm more so relying that you have had an experience of a donkey. Like I'm not like, oh, I'm going to communicate the meaning. Like when people talk, they're fragmented, they're jumping around, they're just throwing words out, right? We don't have carefully structured words. Like the very use of a word is fundamentally a vulnerable act. Because when I say donkey, I am trusting that you've had experiences of donkey, that you are going to be able to see what I'm getting at, and you're going to catch me in conversation. This is really important because I do think if you don't have this fundamental relational dimension in the exchange of words, then you start getting this culture of people that are very dominating in conversation. Like, what do you mean? Tell me what you mean. Like they're using, I like to talk about the game theory of conversation, which often in conversation, there's always an incentive. If the point of the conversation is to win, then you want to take a dominant strategy first. So get offended or tell the other person that doesn't make sense. Use something to put them on the defensive. And then they have to retract and all that different things, right? And I think an understanding of language as this kind of robotic exchange of information and clear definitions make us feel legitimate in treating language according to dominant strategies, because people ought to be able to communicate clearly. They ought to be able to tell me exactly what they mean. But the truth is no one ever does that. That's never actually how language is used. It's only used when we're trying to keep the other out, when we're trying to create a certain space in which people leave us alone. And so I think, looking at Kripke, and also, and then I'll stop, these are just kind of some opening thoughts, because the reason why that's really important is because you know a donkey because you have a body. You have experiences, you have senses, you're in the world. And so language is tied up with the body, and the limits of your body are the limits of your language. And this also suggests an information drunk society that is trying to get new ideas by using the body less, just more words or more, is actually a necessarily self-effacing effort, right? Because if words are really strongly tied to lived experience. Now, this is not cheap empiricism, though. This is not saying that words just represent facts, because you experience emotions, you experience time, you experience field. So this isn't Kripke is not getting at some sort of cheap empiricism. You could absolutely make space for a the field of experience that humans bring. But all of that depends on a body. And if you have a society of people that want to engage in, say, language games or language exchanges that are not using their body, well, then that will necessarily shrink the field of communication Oh, but if you shrink the field, you also don't know you've shrunk the field. So it shrinks and shrinks and shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, and you don't even know it's shrinking. Almost like hell in C.S. Lewis' Great Divorce. It's no bigger than a little ball of dust or different things. Like so, what I've been thinking about is how if you don't use your body and see your body as intimately connected to the conditions of possibility for language, language will naturally shrink on itself, shrinking your world, and you will also not even be able to tell it's shrinking because you don't actually use your body to expand the horizon of it. So it's really important to get on a roof and use a jacksaw, Simon. So well done, sir. You are expanding the limits of your language and the limits of your world, sir. So very, very, very important.
Yeah, I was sort of that was amazing. Thank you, Daniel. I was imagining with the jackhammer, Simon, it could go one of two ways. One would be that it's kind of vibrating you back out into your field, and the other one would just be that it's like throwing you out of your body. And I guess that would depend how you ride the waves of energy
Ooh.
to some degree. Yeah, last night I was down at the beach. I live very close to a beach, and it was a beautiful night. The stars were out, and I was just sitting on a bench, and I was just looking at the moon shining on the ocean, and I was just watching how the ripples of the water were like how the light was dancing across them just because of the movement. And it was just striking me like the infinity that is in my visual field when that's happening, and like the absolute inability to know that in a kind of algorithmic way. Like there's just an infinite set of states that that visual field can show up in, and there's just no way I could come into relationship to it by exhaustively trying to map out all the states it could take. And I was thinking about AI in this sense. And so then I was kind of left with this mystery of like, wow, like what must my relationship to that ocean be like, such that I can know it in all of its forms without actually having a specific form for it. And I'm sure you guys have some thoughts about that. But yeah, I think like with language, something I've kind of been grappling with lately is just like the fractal nature of intelligibility and wanting to be careful in this in spiritual practice not to dismiss language as some kind of like unnecessary constraint, but rather seeing the fractals of intelligibility that are in my body and in the environment and in perception as such also showing up in the language and trying to weave those back together through dialogue rather than just trying to dismiss language.
Mm. Yeah, I can. Lovely points, both of you. I'm feeling a little bit into what is most present for me when you say that. I think language is it really cannot be dismissed in that sense. I think that if we have certain words for certain what we call things, is maybe even the word has a powerful maybe the word even has a powerful role in making it a thing, in defining it, and on a physical or metaphysical level, even. And that a right name for a thing is it comes very close to truth. And so names aren't made up; they fit something. So something has an essence which has a certain sound. Yeah, so in that sense, I think words are incredibly important, and the etymology is also very worthwhile, often to dive into, like specifically to figure out like what are the origins of these words, and yeah, like the chewing on words, like the what does this mean, and then again you invite the body back into it, like what is it what is it somatically doing to your body? How does it feel speaking a word? And that also the as Daniel, as you were talking about the narrowing that happens when the field of language shrinks and the field of possibility shrinks. I think we are entering then in this state of, well, this very clear state of conditioning and a great reduction in friction. And I think that's one of the key drivers of these decontextualized words or this combative way of communication, because it feels very, like you say, game theoretical. And then in that sense, it feels very planned, logically planned out. It's like talking becomes a game, and there are good moves and there are bad moves. And if someone is making, let's say, a move which isn't chess at all, and is just in a complete other dimension, is doing something else, is doing poetry, maybe the person who's doing the chess will be like, no, 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 you cannot use those words in this conversation here. But the narrowing, and this is something I personally struggle with, or that I sometimes becomes incredibly apparent to me, is the narrow bounds of the conditioning that I operate in within, I would say, Dutch society, but then also within, I'd call it global society, like this sense of a hive mind species that communicates rapidly through the exchange of information, and language being one of our main ways of exchanging information, but then having this very narrow band of accepted communication. And that also results in a what I feel is a big loss of vitality and life, and even stranger, it becomes an inversion. So the everyday normal goings on of I'd call it, let's say, just a 9 to 5, or just let's say the standard conditioned operating procedure of life within the hive, within the global human organism. Um, it actually doesn't involve a lot of things that I would call vital to life. So things of space to rest, space to enjoy, um, love, wonder. There seems to be no time for all these more vitalizing things. And at the same time, it's like if you're stuck in it, then it's like, well, this is what life is supposed to be like, or we don't have time for those kind of things. So it's a very strange inversion that happens. And then I just want to tie in like the idea of, well, what is the role of living dialogue then? It's like a de-spelling.
Mm.
It's a ability to shift the axioms, or to make like a very how you say that, like a diagonal or orthogonal move. And if you're crafty at it, maybe you can also sort of pull people with you in doing that. Yeah.
Magnificent. Absolutely magnificent. Well, there's a few thoughts. If you've ever had that experience of the ineffable, like you're saying, Tom, then that is a horizon that you've experienced that then you can bring into language and have the thought that what if language somehow could possibly be animated differently with the awareness of the ineffable, as I'll just put that term, and could it actually somehow approach the ineffable? But if you've never had an experience of the ineffable, then that thought is not possible to you, right? And it would seem often the experience of the ineffable is outside of language brought to language. And just mystical experiences, childhood, et cetera, so forth, right? I don't want to say that always is the case, but there's something about the really, really Simone Weil attention, William Blake grain of sand, infinity, like that seems to be more in the not use of language. That then, though, because you've had that experience, you can then bring it into language and start relating to it differently. As what if this could be a creative space to point toward or somehow participate in that experience versus just an information exchange, right? We often don't think about how our understanding of certain, I'll just say, fields or something like language or even science is actually affected by the sum total of experiences that we've had, right? Like a book that I always think is great on science, Paul Feyerabend in his book Against Method. There's also the knowledge procedure, this recent book that was comparing Popper and Kuhn and different people. But the point is this. Often great ideas, we have this idea of a kind of methodological sort of, you're in the room looking for consensus and you come up with the ideas. No, man, Galileo is like, this is it. He's using political metaphor. It's not, and he even is kind of making up data sometimes that later turns out to be true, but he doesn't actually have it. Well, you get this wild messiness, actually, that is behind science. Now, of course, there's truth to Popper. Of course, there's Kuhn, but at the heart of it is this wild, unbound creativity that's more of a sort of rabid, what's very important with Galileo that Feyerabend points out, it wasn't just the church that was against Galileo. It was the scientific community that was against Galileo. Everyone was against Galileo because he was going against the consensus. Well, if you never, for example, hear that idea about science, if you have this notion of this consensus where everyone agrees and science methodically advances, then you would never, ever think to bring that way of being, way of the body even, into the laboratory. Which then, of course, if the laboratory never gave you another Michel Planier or Galileo or whatever, well, then it would never occur to you that it's not occurring because you're not bringing the right mode. It must just be that we haven't done this long enough. We just need to keep this methodology going. We just need this current grand system to keep going, right? And it goes on and on and on. And again, I do like where C.S. Lewis says hell is locked from the inside. I think that is correct. The door is, it's locked from the inside, actually, because you have a certain structure by which you carry on. And also, I've been reading this tremendous book that's on polymaths by Peter Burke, which is an extraordinary book because it suggests that the polymath is not just the Renaissance, man. There, like in the 16th century, there was kind of a culture, really, that incubated the polymath. And a way to put at it, let's put it this way, and this is very simplistic, and obviously it wasn't the same everywhere. But today, if you tell someone I'm reading poetry, the first question you're going to get is, why? Do you have a paper to write? Do you have a test to take? Are you going to be a professor? In a polymathic culture as an ideal, and I'm not saying this was perfect, if you said I was reading poetry, people would go, great. Of course you are. You have free time. That's what you would do, of course. You wouldn't be doing it just because you're going to be a professor. You have time, so you're going to engage in the humanities. And you see the thing that Burke is kind of basically suggesting, that culture is what gives you the Leibniz, what gives you the great geniuses, where people feel permission to actually explore different horizons. And then you combine that together with the French saloons, the Scottish Enlightenment, people getting together to drink. You have that polymathic culture, if you will, combined with people then gathering who then change the quality of how they talk with one another, that then the new horizons they see there, they bring back to their rooms, and then they bring back to the conversation. You get that feedback loop. That's where you get this flourishing of human beings. And what's also radical, like the other thing that Burke keeps pointing out, is one of the problems is we tend to create this divide between generalist and specialist because we only remember the polymaths is good at one thing. Leibniz was good at philosophy. Well, actually, he was considered an expert on China when he was alive as well, right? You forget that like people like Michel Planier, he's not just a philosopher, he's a chemist and he's doing all you could go on and on. So the point Burke is also getting at is often a person's specialty actually emerges from a radical curiosity about all of life in this belief in things like a universal science or an ineffable, these kind of transcendent goals leading to this widespreading life that then out of that emerges greatness versus you focus on one thing and you go from there. Now, of course, focusing on one thing can be very great because one of the great problems of polymaths is they never finish anything. But you have this idea that this way of engagement with reality was tied to this full living of exploring all things, and the culture gave permission to people to do that. So they brought that to the French saloons. They brought that to their relationships. And all of it also was not a mode of conversation of give me the facts and playing, like I think you put that very well, Simon, on, this is chess, you're playing the wrong game, you're out. Everything was on the table. Poet, you bring your game. Scientist, you bring your game. Historian, you bring your game, because it is only by it's in the metexis, to use that William Desmond's term, the space between all of these different games, that actually out of that comes the sense of the ineffable that changes the quality of our day-to-day activity and how we use language. And I think for me, Voicecraft is getting at that. I think that's what we're trying to recover in the, this online space that I like to call the social coordination mechanism. People use like Vervaeke will talk about Silk Road or liminal way, et cetera, so forth. There's a certain recovery of this relation between how you live your life and these experiences of the infinite that you're bringing that I think are kind of return to a polymathic culture, which again is not polymath for the sake of, oh, I'm going to be a genius. No, it's more cultural. It's where if you're reading poetry, because you want to read poetry, that's considered a good use of time, as opposed to now, it's considered a bad use of time unless you're getting paid for it. That shift, that cultural, that's the main thing I really have been drawing from this book, is like very often we can't even imagine there is, like it would even be possible for there to be a world where people saw reading poetry for its own sake as a good use of time. But there's evidence to suggest it has happened, that it isn't a concrete actuality in history, that people use their time in French saloons is not seen as wasted. Now, of course, I don't want to idealize it, but that sort of recapturing of that sort of notion, because ultimately, I think our humanity is really tied to our participation in the humanities, which then actually then exists in all of these different fields to tie back to one another. Because what ends up happening, let me put it, I'll stop with this point. So many things have been said that are so important. Humanities and simply moving between, say, poetry, history, all the different fields keeps your mind from getting locked into a single game, a single language game, right? And the problem with the sciences is precisely they work so great. They do work. They give you results. So there's perhaps a unique temptation to let that structure do your thinking for you more than the other structures, right? But then the humanities over here can't tell you what they exist for because they don't know their own history, and they themselves are not having these kind of conversations. So then it becomes about writing papers about Hamlet that nobody reads, right? So you have both of this inability to create perhaps a fullness to human experience, autonomous narrowing, but then also a inability to recognize the history and the value of these things, because many people who do the humanities are embarrassed by it as well. So I think there's an effort too that's just so important to reclaiming a kind of conversing that is more of this culture where the scientist and the poet and all of these people are actually going, how do we bring all of these things together to have something emerge out of it? And I guess what I'm saying too is that the willingness of people to do that does seem strongly tied to if they've had ineffable experiences like the ocean. Like if they have had these kind of glimmers of eternity through the transience, this sense that there is an ever deepening in everything that's in front of you, that seems to make them more open to engaging in these spaces because, well, maybe it's this. It's because they've had an emotional experience of the absurdity of narrowness. Like if you've had an experience of the vastness, then you emotionally feel the absurdity of narrowness. And you don't tend to change until you feel something. Like you can have the idea that it's good to, lifelong learn and it's good to explore many different fields. But until you feel it in your deepest self, that doesn't translate into daily practices. So there's something so important about that experience of the ineffable. And of course, as we talk about all the time at Voicecraft, there is an effort to honor the mystery, orbit the mystery in the conversation, which then you're creating a methodology that the conversation in of itself is also creating a reminder of that experience you also had at the ocean. So you're trying to get something more where the forms match, where they're more aligned in what they're doing. And I think that's extremely important when there are so many temptations of becoming narrow. I'll stop there.
Nice. Yeah, I feel like there's part of the trickiness of this is there's an enjoyment in narrowing.
Yes.
And I'm sure we'd both agree there's a kind of there's something necessary about narrowing to this is a bit of an extractive way of thinking about it, but to kind of get the most out of a certain instance or a frame. You kind of go into it fully and then you're kind of at the very edge and that feels amazing. But the difficulty is that it's only viable for that instance, but nature's there underneath you moving. And in the next instance, your narrowness is no longer applicable. And so you can either try to hold everyone there with you. And some people get really good at doing that to the point where they can hold an entire state in that frame with them, or even the globe. I think there are people right now who are trying to hold the entire world in a single frame with them because they're terrified of nature and they're terrified of death.
Yep.
That's not all of it, but it kind of feels like there's a challenge here with constraint as such and nature as such, and understanding nature either as this force that is relentless and keeps moving, or there seems to be this intuition that a lot of the modernists hold that if they don't hold reality together, it's going to fall apart. So there's either this sense of like, oh my God, nature's more than we can handle, or oh my God, nature is falling apart and I must be the single force that binds it. And so, yeah, it seems like as participants or as agents on any scale, we're in this constant tension of like needing to model the world and take up frames, and even deeper than that, take up identities or take up a body. But then we're also nature and things are constantly moving and changing. And so we have to be in some kind of dance. And maybe it's like important for some of us to get lost in frames. And that's when we need to rely on distributed intelligence to kind of help us all stay moving, but also like making the most out of each instance as we kind of zero in on it. And so that is conversational alchemy, right? It's together we can kind of fill these niches and fill the niche of learning how to change niches. And so, yeah, sort of, but all of that requires a kind of, I guess, like a commitment to love would be one way of saying it, but kind of seeing beyond our own narrow need and our narrow sense of our own ultimate purpose and into the broader purpose of cosmos, however we want to understand that. And I think the saving grace here is there's such an enjoyment in participating in that. It's an enjoyment that just far exceeds the enjoyment of like being the man for a moment, you know, which is what I think. You're either like playing in the dance with all the deities, or you're just trying to be the man for a moment.
Wow. Yeah. No, I like that. Yeah. So many images there, and one that keeps coming back is so a practice that I call it a practice. It's just something that I deeply enjoy doing, and the whole thing about it is that it's very free of shape and discipline. Is I often go out into the woods, and the woods here in the Netherlands are quite. There's nothing dangerous here, let's say. So it's very easy to just wander in the woods. Yeah, maybe ticks and mosquitoes, but that's it. And I walk around off the paths with my backpack and a blanket. And usually, or I go to certain spots that I highly enjoy, that I find interesting. And I put down a blanket and I just lie down for an hour or an hour and a half or two. And sometimes I sleep, sometimes I meditate, or I just watch nature and listen. And oftentimes when I cycle then back, those are the moments I feel most rejuvenated and I get the sort of things fall into place. Um, and I cannot help but really feel that I'm having a conversation or a dialogue with the forest. And it's speaking with me, through me, but in very subtle ways. So past language, but it's speaking through the body. And as I'm tuning in and learning more about sort of my senses and sort of the physical senses, but also I would call them the extrasensory senses. It's incredibly subtle how communication can work and how dialogue can work. Because if I'm listening to the two of you and I'm listening to the words, I'm getting the information of the words, but at the same time, I'm getting metaphorical images or I'm getting physical sensations. And if I stay with those physical sensations, they might open up something else. And here I'm also, for instance, me evoking even that place, for instance, in the woods that I enjoy, already pulls it in presence. So it's already here. And so it's also feeding or fueling into this dialogue. And this is what I'm so interested in also what Daniel, what you were sort of pointing out or expanding on this concept of communication, reading, let's say, polymaths. So I think most likely a polymath, I don't know, but most likely a polymath starts off with a deep fascination with a certain subject and a specialization, but then I think gets this moment of opening again and then noticing like, oh, I can specialize in everything and I can find the same seed of enjoyment in everything. Um, Maybe we are in a, and then I'm thinking in the sense of humanity as a global species. Maybe we are in the sort of pre pre-dawn moment, let's say, of this reopening, of this opening to back to wonder. And I cannot help but think that non-human nature, I would call it nature with the capital, as you were also talking about, Tom. I think that I think we're being sort of washed out of our houses, out into the open, and we cannot help but become deeply reconnected and re-engaged with the moving reality instead of the stationary modern castle. Let's say the modern sand castle is being pulled back into the sea. Um, and then I just find it super interesting indeed to come back to the point of the body and language. And what will the French cafes look like of the 21st century of this moment? Because I was active in academia, also in the molecular biology in the sciences, and recently I attended some seminar or I attended again some talks coming from academia. And the main thing I noticed, and this was after a long hiatus, main thing I noticed is how disembodied people are when they speak, how incredibly disembodied they are. But that's a feature and not a bug. So it's also not a judgment. But I noticed like, so in order for a lot of people, and I think for the majority of people, to become very good at conceptual thinking and abstract thought, is they need to abstract themselves from their body. Because in that space, you can pretend, you can investigate a lot of things that you might physically not have a way of interacting with. And that it becomes, of course, if you're doing natural sciences, then there is that window because you can actually resonate or feel with a subject that you're studying, be it an animal, a plant, a microbe, any living process, because those processes are alive in us as well. But even there, so I was also mostly disembodied during my period in academia. So I've recently, like in the last years, regained, or I desperately felt like, oh, I need to sort of reconnect to my body. And that involves like a lot of different things, like physically being reconnected, but having an embodied sense of the emotions of the heart, of what the heart is actually connected to. And the heart as a sensing tool, that is also something that has been opening up for me more and more, which I think like, oh, this quality, the quality of reading through the heart, because we do that super unconsciously. So of course you meet people in the sciences who are massively passionate and are embodied. Those exist. But my experience, the majority is very, very disconnected from that quality. But again, I think also a proper, you aren't a proper scientist if you add yourself into the picture, right? If you are an active participant in what you're studying. So you should actively dissociate actually from what you're working on, which is, I think, profoundly unhealthy in this period of time, which we're in the world as we're living in, because then we're mapping not a living planet, but we're mapping a corpse. So a preemptive, we're prematurely turning it into a corpse, and then from there seek to reanimate it. And of course, this very much fits like Ian McGilchrist's work on the left and the right hemisphere, and that the left hemisphere deals with abstract, lifeless things, and also has a pretty strong preference of dealing with inanimate things, and also likes treating animate things as being inanimate. And so this is something that worries me. And at the same time, as I was listening to this talk, I just couldn't help thinking like, oh wow, I kind of know what a big part of the work for the collective, what the work will be in the coming century, or let's say the coming decennia. It will be profoundly reintroducing the body and embodiment in all aspects of culture, but especially in the sciences, I think, because as Daniel also mentioned, science works, and as long as it works, it's like we don't need to play another game. We can just use this game, and we get everything to work through it, right? Yeah.
Magnificent. A lot said that was really, really well put. Tom, on that idea of this kind of pleasure and narrowness, I think this is very important. There is a certain pleasure in understanding for which we sacrifice the joy of orbiting. And you see, because when I understand things, I go, oh, I got to hold on it. And you get this sort of, when you compress, like, there's a lot of talk about the dangers of reductionism. Now, of course, reductionism can be a focusing that helps you work with something well, and then you put it back in the hole and you move away, right? The problem is reductionism is enjoyable until you get the consequences of it, because you feel like you understand and you have power, right? Like there's a certain enjoyment, and I kind of mean it in the psychoanalytical Jason sort of way, right? There's an enjoyment in compression, and there's a joy in flattening. Because when you make it flat, then it's smooth, it's not dangerous, and you feel like you're over it, right? But here's the problem. You get habituated to that enjoyment, and you lose the ability to snap out of it. And that's a kind of damnation, if you will, right? Like the problem, like, for example, with the scientists, absolutely, you want the scientists to be dispassionate. But the problem is they lose the ability to be passionate in the habit of the dispassionate. And so they get stuck in it, right? Another example is economics. How do we deal with the problem of global pluralism? By commodification, because it's a language. I don't need to understand Hinduism to know that that person's an engineer and they make 100,000 a year. Okay, understanding. I know them, right? Economics gives you a feeling of understanding things. I know how the world works. I just need to know prices and jobs and utility and pragmatism, right? The problem is that's actually shielding you from the fullness of the neighbor, who's actually way more than their economic position. But here's the problem. If I actually go beyond their economic position, and it turns out I start bordering on that infinity, and I don't have any skills and I'm not used to this, I get overwhelmed, I get anxious, I get emotionally disturbed, and I leave, right? Likewise, if I'm used to all the status and all of the success being a result of the dispassionate mode, when I try to bring passion into the arena and my coworkers or co-scientists then mock me, or I lose status, well, then I'm going to be trained not to do it, right? We do this to ourselves. It's not like there's some big brother necessarily that's forcing this upon us. It is the way we relate with one another on our inability to handle fullness, really. And you see modes of compression, we can call it, or reduction, or compression, or flattening. Modes of compression we see in science, modes of compression we see in economics, modes of compression we see in getting to the point. You could even say maybe law or different things. These are extremely useful. The use is the problem. The more useful the map, the easier it is to forget the territory, right? And the problem is the problem with human beings is we generate habits. You see, if we could be dispassionate and not at the same time, we make our tools and our tools make us, as the famous saying goes, right? It turns out the medium is the message and everything just about is a medium. That's the problem. The medium is not just the TV. It's actually the classroom, as Neil Postman talks about. It is the laboratory. Everything is a medium. The economics is a medium, and that works on our habits. The problem is when you get social status for reductionism in various forms, if also it's the only thing you've ever been able to use that makes diversity intelligible to you, if it's the only thing you've been able to employ by which to make this person in an entirely different religion with an entirely different review, you have something to talk about. Oh, we can talk about our jobs. Oh, we can talk about football. We can talk about sports. Like there's a way also in which the consumer culture is another sort of compression, because it narrows the range of the kind of movies people are watching. Oh, I have a sense that people are probably watching football on Sunday. It creates a sort of pretty good estimation of the activities that people are doing in the culture. Therefore, I can talk about them and have a means by which to talk with my neighbor who otherwise I'd be exposed to their complexity, and that might overwhelm me, like a Lovecraft creature, right? And you see, so what ends up happening is we get in a habit of compression, and we eventually lose the capacity to get out of that habit. And that's when you're in damnation. If you're going to use any, and I'll stop with it, although there's much more to say on the telepathy, like language, very important stuff. And what you were saying also, Simon, on the polymath, that's exactly right. There's an expertise, but then there's also the culture allows a person who's a specialist in something to open up beyond that. They're not going to be made feel, it's not like there's automatically a, Leibniz, why are you studying China? That's not your thing. Or why are you studying philosophy and geometry? That's not your thing. You're wasting these times with these debate with Descartes. No, there was more of a sort of cultural understanding that this was an acceptable thing to do. Now, of course, I'm not trying to make it idealistic, but it's where now you got to stay in your lane. Even in small talk, this is the key. Of course, you should stay in your lane if we're talking literally walking into the government and making decisions if you don't know about it. But literally now you have a culture of staying in your lane at dinner, in just fun. You're supposed to stay in your lane, not just as you're making your money. Like it's a cultural narrowing that's also occurred, right? Like unless you're an expert, unless you've studied, like why would you even talk about that? Like if you talk with your neighbors about a poem you're reading, very often there'll be a nod. Okay, so how's work? Like quickly switch the topic back, right? Because there's not even the skills to know how to play with something that you have never heard before. Like there's actually a skill when you hear that someone's reading a poem and you don't like poetry to go, oh, well, what are some things about the poem you like? And to actually be able to entertain that conversation when it is about something you don't know, that's actually a conversational skill, right? But if there's no cultural incentive to learn that skill or institutions or places to learn that skill, well, then all people can do is change the subject because basically, if you don't have the skills to deepen a subject, the only option is to change the subject, right? And we have a culture that can change but not deepen, because that's getting into things like voicecraft. The capacity to deepen is how you reside. Because here's the other thing. If you're talking with someone and they change the subject or you change the subject, there's an alienation that occurs with that. No one may say anything, but they just might not come over tomorrow. They might just not be there tomorrow, right? We tend to go where we feel deepening. And if the things we bring to the table, the person we're with can't deepen them with us, then that creates a feeling of separation, even if you're in their presence, right? So the capacity to kind of deepen with, I'm also always taken with all of the studies, and again, I don't have them on hand or anything, but the research on how much we gauge the quality of our relationships by the depth of conversation. Like people really do actually determine the depths of relationships by the kind of conversations they have. It's the most, I'm not saying it's just that, but it's almost the most at-hand metric. It's the most readily available metric. You could also argue it's the one you're most participating in, because what do you probably do most of all with a human being you see most often? Probably talk. That's probably the number one activity you do with them. Even if you're a shoulder-to-shoulder kind of person, you still talk with them probably more than you do shoulder-to-shoulder stuff, right? Talking, like words are like the blood of relationships. You die without blood in your body. Without words, there's like no relationship, right? It just doesn't happen. Now, that doesn't mean only words matter, but there's something about, it's a pretty safe bet to judge the quality of a relationship by the terms of words. And here's the key. The key quality is the ability to deepen. If you change, people don't feel like you're having a conversation if you change the subject. It feels too bumpy. It doesn't feel like you're having a conversation. It just feels like you're exchanging information, right? Like if you always change the subject, the subconscious mind does not seem to register that as a conversation. You register it as an exchange more so. The ability to feel like you're having conversation with people depends on the deepening of a subject, not the changing of a subject. Now, you can converge on a different subject in the deepening, like you find an avenue there that converges with another subject, but the transition must feel smooth, if you will. The transition must have a certain naturalness to it, right? Well, that's a skill. And if you don't have that skill, then as you talk with people, that jaggedness will be there, and there will be a hit to relational quality that occurs. So that ability to deepen is extremely important, and those are skills that we have to learn, and we have to have those abilities. I guess the last I'll stop. It's also really interesting to me how many fields that came out of polymath, like semiotics by Peirce, C.S. Peirce, for example. That came from a polymath. Psychoanalysis, computer science. These are fields that now you can be a specialist in, but actually were fundamentally in their origin thanks to more polymathic activity. And actually what that I think suggests is that the new field, like if you're whatever the new fields will be, almost by definition will be emergent from polymathic individuals, right? It almost has to be if you think about it. And if you say we need new thinking today for new conditions of possibility to deal with various problems that are occurring, well, then aren't you saying that there needs to be like new fields of thought that don't exist, right? Okay, well then let's look at polymathic cultures that birthed so many new fields, right? Because polymathic fields tend to be, I want to say, higher dimensionality. Like you're connecting, they're more geometrical than algebraic, right? Well, if basically there's something about higher dimensionality that's necessary today, which I think goes to Simon's point on bringing in the body, because if you're really bringing in the body, you're saying there's a suggestion that there is a need for higher dimensionality in the operation of the human subject, which of course makes sense if the great problem is habits of flattening now. We have all these habits of flattening. So if we need to gain the ability to open up, which also means the ability to handle the complexity of opening up, to close, open, well, then it's going to require the body. And then, of course, the other thing that's just so critical, if all that kind of opening and closing sounds crazy, well, if you look at a book like Hofstadter, Surface and Essence, and how basically all words, they call them halos. All words are analogous. All words are more like halo. The word donkey is an expanding circle of experience and then closes in and expands. Words are more like halos than they are definitions. And I've spoken with guys since talk about that. All intelligibility, basically, this is a massive claim. All intelligibility seems to have this opening, closing structure, where it's more like an orbiting structure and then an orbiting in, then orbiting back out, then opening, then closing. It's not like a picking a pen out of a random pile of information, say, oh, pen. It's more like an orbiting around the entire toy bin. And then as you orbit, you get a smaller orbit on the pen, but then it widens back out and it keeps doing that. That seems to be how intelligibility works, following like Hofstadter and Sanders. And if that's the case, then the ability of the human being to open and close, which I do think requires the body, because I think basically what all language and senses and everything doing is more on the side, not of gathering and of conditioning our experience, like going to the gym, the way we are conditioned to experience reality. And that has to be expanded on, but if it all has this opening close function, then the more human beings can do that, the more we actually become like what language actually is. That's the funny thing. Like language actually is more like this in its structure of opening and closing. And we have actually come to define ourselves according to an idea of language as information exchange, which it actually never was. And we've kind of made ourselves in the image and likeness of that reductionist linear exchange of information and believing we're becoming more aligned with intelligibility when we're becoming less aligned with intelligibility, which of course is a point that kind of goes with what Viveki will say on AI. We understand AI is intelligence, so we then use intelligence like AI, and we make ourselves in the image and likeness of artificial intelligence or metaphors or whatever, because we actually, in being a higher dimension than that, can choose therefore to be a lower dimension of that, right? And what's very interesting is that mistake being made in AI, in my opinion, is actually the mistake we've been making with language as a whole for a long time. And it's just a continuation of that mistake that we need to reclaim. In a way, I think we do that is by reclaiming the body, as Simon was saying. I think it's extremely important.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. One thing, or there's many things, but one thing I'll draw out to start with lately I've been going on quite a deep dive into some more metaphysical waters. And what I notice is that if I go divergent enough with the like streams of language that I'm dipping into, very quickly the semantics start breaking down for me. And one impulse when that happens is to try to stop listening to one stream that was kind of contradicting the other stream that I'm taking in. But the other kind of impulse that I feel I've learned to identify and then embrace is the recognition that when that breakdown occurs, when the word that I thought meant this gets called into question, there's actually a transformation that's brewing when that's happening. But I have to endure a kind of valley crossing where I feel like I know nothing, like literally nothing. I'll sit there and I'm like, wait, these terms that I thought meant this don't mean that anymore. What does that mean? Like, who am I now? I don't even know myself at that point. And I think that's like part of the radicality of this. But I think this is where the body comes in because there's something about the constraints in the body that are far more familiar and they feel more like a home. And I think the body can become a kind of anchor when you're traversing through different landscapes of meaning because it's where our deepest identity lives.
Mm.
Like I think there's a part of Tom that is physics. And so long as I'm in my body, that's not really going to change. If it does, we've got some serious problems. But um, yeah, there's something about like the solidity of reality is bottom heavy, but we're trying to invert that and make it top heavy. And then we become like a leaning tower that's on the verge of toppling in any moment. But yeah, like another thing that was coming through was the social anxieties and how rampant they are. Like I love the way you were describing that, Daniel, and these interactions with our neighbors and when we go down to the shop and just having no fucking clue like how to talk to each other. And that I feel that is like very much a phenomena of disembodiment,
Mhm.
a disembodiment, and then like being dragged across the flat land of the digital information landscape where my like my conceptual identity is just being smeared across the screen as like I'm being dragged along this
Mm.
like violently fast stream of information with no sense of like my center in the ground. But yeah, I feel like when we return to the body, one of the things we find first is like genuine curiosity and genuine care that actually contain within it a kind of like reflection or expression of our soul, like our uniqueness and relationship to the spirit of nature. And to the degree that I know my soul is the degree to which I'm very comfortable being in a conversation because I'm not afraid that somehow I'm going to be revealed as like false or phony or like not knowing the story of the times, it's because I know myself and I know myself as nature. And I feel like that is where the body really shines, is in kind of a self-knowing that is deeper than the bullshit that we seem to be drowning in right now.
Mm. I really want to continue on that thread. Um, okay, I often am visited by the experience or I'd say dreams or when I'm in with plant medicine. Very clear the sense of the human journey, and then I mean the human species and the journey we've been on over these well since probably the dawning of Homo sapiens. Um, Especially the last couple thousand years have been like holding our breath. It feels like holding our breath and going below the surface. And so I think that parts of our bodies have been pulled into the earth, or our bodies have been pulled down into the earth quite deep, which make it very difficult for us to embody it. So I get the image of our tether to our connection to our bodies being thin for a long period of time, which means that our bodies were available to be, and I don't want to use the term hijacked because that already implies a sort of value statement, but the bodies were available to be incorporated into a larger body. And you could call that empire or civilization, or, well, you have all these recent variants of this. Um, and it was probably necessary, I think. And I want to pull again also the perspective one scale up to more a Gaia-centric perspective. So the human superorganism being a organ within a superorganism. And so how I feel the last thousands of years were with all the wars and, well, going from a tribal, small scaled species to a, well, I'd call it a hive-like species. Well, that needed that. I think that development needed a species to hold its breath and to go very, very deep. Again, grow very, very fast. Also with the use of these resources which were available to us by Gaia, which were stored millions of years before in the shape of fossil carbons. And then this transmutation is happening. So the trauma, let's say, of these massive amounts of death that happened on a scale we cannot imagine, these mass extinction events that led to fossil carbon becoming a thing, that was death locked outside of the biosphere. So death locked outside of the circle of life and death, which is trauma. I'd call that trauma as well, which is also a stuck memory, is stuck in outside of a living process of the body. And I think the human has, like Gaia, the human in its short lifespan, relatively short, has endured quite a bit of heavy trauma. And so we are coming home to a traumatized body, a traumatized collective body with a lot of unresolved, untransmuted fossil fuels in our bodies. What are we going to use those fossil fuels for, right? And then that flips also the perspective on trauma. So trauma is a very heavy word, and it also implies quite heavy suffering, but usually the suffering took place in the past, is kept as a stored memory, which is creating more and more suffering as life goes on until it gets transmuted. So that signal wants to be seen. So for me, there's a lot of value also in thinking about what does a return to polymathic culture, what does that look like on a planetary scale, on a planetary organism? What organ is the human going to be for this planet? Currently, we are probably, as I would picture it, like a sort of bloated how you call it, waterlogged head. And that's not necessarily just because we are with 8 billion. And there's a clear sign that population numbers will start evening out and then rapidly decreasing, not factoring in like fertility problems with, again, products of fossil fuels in our environment, these endocrine disruptors. So I have this feeling that there's this big shift happening, and I feel it's profoundly valuable to see the role of the human body in it, but also the human with a capital H, the collective body of the human, and the fields of information that is stored there and that needs to be transmuted in order to get to this higher dimensionality of being. But that again needs our perspective to also shift towards this more planetary scale consciousness, because otherwise we're locked into this lower state of knowing, and then we're locked into how do we make this work, as in we, just the humans. Well, actually, it's this move towards how do we as a collective biosphere, as a living uh, organism do this. And there's just one last thread I want to add to this. We are renting this thing. And some of us have been renting this thing many times. It's how I see it is we are the act of incarnation is a projection of a certain field, which we call the soul, which we might call the soul, onto this living metabolizing planet and this living soup of molecules. And then the body assembles around that field or in this field. And the information that is stored there is both us, our soul, but it's very much Gaia. It's very much the planet. And the planet is old. And life on this planet is old. So inorganic life is incredibly old. And then organic life is also incredibly old. So there's so much information and wisdom stored there that we cannot access if we are disembodied. And so life here on this earth, even though I'm a fan and even though I enjoy transcendence or states of being where you go out of the body, there's way more knowledge in my experience, which is useful and helpful for living here on this planet, which can be found by diving deep into life and into the body. Because the body is a doorway to all the, I would say, vital information that we also need.
Outstanding. I think that point on the transcendence needing to come back to the body is extremely important. Hegel talks about spurious infinity and true infinity. The problem with experiencing the infinite is that there's actually a temptation in that, which precisely in its wonder can lead you to a spurious disembodied infinity. You actually have to sublate it into the body for it to be a true infinity that changes the quality of your relation with actuality, right? Like, there's a very interesting way in which all good things, if disordered, are bad. Like, that's kind of an Augustine idea. Like, just because, you say this experience was so wonderful, well, that actually may tempt you to think you don't need to bring it back to the body, actually, right? Like, there are people who have like a near-death experience. Sometimes that destroys people's lives because then they're miserable after they come back. You have to be ready for the mystical, if you will. You have to be ready for the transcendent. But then also, you need communities that can help you reintegrate with the transcendent, right? And people who understand what you're talking about. That's another issue. If you can't find people who understand what you're talking about, that becomes a problem. And you can, it would be another topic, but you can kind of suggest that religions are often at their best when they provide communities of people to reintegrate the mystical into everydayness. When they become overly about structure, then they lose it. But it's just like I always think about Simone Weil or even Teresa of Avila. Like, there's this interesting idea that the mystical meant they had to really pay attention with the church. Like, what should I share? What should I not? How do I integrate? That there was a artfulness to transcendence. It was not merely, I experienced the transcendent, now I'm done, and I don't need to worry about the body, and let me tell everyone. There's actually this art of unveiling with the UN in parentheses. Well, don't keep it a little veiled, but not too much. Gauge who's ready for it. Jesus goes away from the crowd. Don't tell them. Like, there's a artfulness to this, because there's actually, to me, an understanding that there's some sort of mode of subjectivity required for a person actually not to be destroyed by the transcendent, right? Like, which I would say Voicecraft is cultivating. Like, it's really important, and Ross Bird talks about this, and obviously my beloved Dante. God destroys you. That's the problem. God in religions, if you see him, you die. It's not like, the way to kind of look at a God of, the Judaism and Christianity is this, this very interesting in Islam is this very interesting tension where, God, if he's experienced too much, destroys creation, and yet creation needs a relation with God. Oh, well, that's a problem. How does God have a relation with creation as necessary for creation to thrive? And yet, if there's too much of a relation too quickly in the wrong terms, it destroys creation. Bird talks about it as the problem between holiness and unveiling, right? Beatrice, an example that I adore is Dante asked Beatrice, "Why aren't you smiling?" And she's like, "Yeah, at this point if I would have smiled this early in your journey, it would destroy you. It would reduce you to ash." Beatrice would be like a Lovecraft creature in the ancient one. And you see, that's the issue. When we're dealing with the most important things, we're dealing with things that, if approached in the wrong way, under the wrong condition, destroy us because they are good. And thus, in their goodness, they have a power that overwhelms us. And you see, one of the problems is and by not bringing in the body, being of higher dimensionality, we don't meet the conditions necessary for experience the highest things, right? We don't actually have the capacity to have them not destroy us. So then this is what ends up happening. We don't have the capacity for the highest things not to destroy us. So then they destroy some people, and you say, yep, I knew we didn't need to do that. Let's go back to the dispassionate compression and never deal with those things again, because look what they do when we get into all that stuff. It leads to crazy stuff, right? So don't do that, right? No. You're basically saying, a way to look at it is once you get into these higher things, yeah, you can have problems with people creating their cults or creating conspiracy or creating all these different things. So you say, well, this is why we need to go to reductionism. No, that leads to the flattening that destroys you as well. You have to go into the labyrinth. You just need to know the golden thread. You got to go into that risk. We just need the skills in the community and the ways of thinking to go into it. The way is not to run, is to learn the art of, but there's real risk here. Well, there has to be real risk here if there's going to be the cultivation of true value and courage in the human being, right? It's by doing these dangerous explorations into the transcendent that actually it becomes possible for humans to be truly human, for us to have our humanity extended versus replaced. So there's something very important here. And I should also note, like what you're saying with the body, again, what's so fascinating with these polymaths is they're doing botany, they're doing agriculture. Like, it's not just like math and literature. It's like they're out in the field, right? I mean, there's this beautiful mixture, architecture, like there's this beautiful mixture of tinkering and thinking that all kind of comes together, which is really hard for us to think because we're so used to learning as not using your hands. Like, it is just really hard for us to even seriously think about shopcraft as soulcraft, as that book puts it. I always like the motorcycle. And the other thing too that I think should be noted with the polymathic, polymath, more so than being about, say, knowing everything, it becomes a clearing for friendship. Philosophy is a very interesting word because it has philo. It's tied to friendship. Cicero talks about it. Agamben has an essay on it. There's this weird relationship with the capacity of people to have friends with their ability to do philosophy. Now, philosophy in this sense is not say, oh, I've read Plato, I've read Aristotle. No, it's a certain mode. D.C. Sendler talks about the orbiting. He talks about gathering under the beautiful, the good in Plato. Like, it's this certain sort of soul music, we could even say harmony. And you see, the polymathic allows you, when someone brings up any possible subject that they care about, you're able to entertain it, right? So what we have to also, what's critical is to see the polymathic as a condition that expands the potential of friendship and the range of friendship across diversity, across many different people, because you learn how to deepen. This is the key. Like, the more polymathic you are, the more you're able to deepen any possible subject or topic that anyone brings up, whether it be their emotional life or whatever. That is the skill that is primary. The skill of being able to do that, to, with a person in relation, to deepen and thus create a feeling of intimacy, because deepness and intimacy goes together. That is why the polymathic matters so much. And I think basically the way that we as human beings move toward the holy is with friends. Friends are the mechanism by which we, at a rate that we can handle, move toward the mysterious and the transcendence in community. Friendship is the golden thread that actually is how we can extend our humanity. And you see, basically, we live in a world today where people don't have friends, right? The friend session, like, there's this horrible, people don't have friends. But what's so interesting is there's a strain of thought that basically suggests that, yeah, if you don't have the polymathic, if you don't have this deepening capacity, you won't have friends. You will have associates, you will have coworkers, and the closest you will get to friends is the ones, here's the trick, who are most similar to you. The ones who have the most life experiences. You'll be able to deepen with them, but now we have a problem because that's anti-pluralism. The friends you will have will be those of whom are least diverse from you. And so what ends up happening is friendship without this deepening capacity tends to be outsourced to those of whom similar work experience, life, religion, and so on and so forth. And we tribalize, bifurcate, and we separate. right? Like if you don't get this polymathic capacity, then friendship will actually serve division. It will serve cutting off from the whole. And as Simon was saying, we need a planetary mindset, more of a Gaia, right? Well, that means you have to have the ability to not have your intimacy go in the direction of pigeonhole, right? We need to have the ability to expand the range of our intimacy. Well, that is a capacity to deepen no matter what is thrown at you, right? And that's what the polymathic affords. And without that, I like what Simon was saying very much on this fossil fuel within the human being to use. That is not going to be realized unless we have this sort of capacity. And I also really like this. There's this really interesting way I think about how history works. And I think it speaks to what you were saying, Simon, so well, is where there's something here that we run past. Then we get to the past where we're facing the consequences of running past. And so we have to go back and then go into the future. Like the reason you ran past it is because you actually didn't have the development of consciousness to see the thing you ran past. You have to go past it to be able to see it, but then you have the choice of going back. And here's the thing. That means it's actually a free choice, though. If it was in the future, you could say it's not a free choice because you don't know it's there, right? But if it's in the past, it actually can be a product of human autonomy and therefore something humans grow in. It also inherently brings a humility to the past, a certain not seeing yourself as better than the past because there was something back there you missed. And so I think history has this going past, then go back, then forward structure to it. You know, Hegel would call that sublation. You were talking about transit. I think that's exactly right. We missed something. The things I would say that that are tied to what we missed is it is not the case that technological reasoning or abstract thought was a mistake. It's only a mistake at this point of saturation, to use Alex Ebert's term, if we do not go back. Now it is a mistake because now you're, I think, overfitting, right? You're overfitting something and you need to go back and reclaim it. If you give up, say, technology now, well, now you're underfitting, if I'm using these terms correctly, you're underfitting the human condition. So you have to do this back thing to avoid overfitting, right? You know, if E.O. Wilson basically is like, he asked the question in the Social Conquest of the Earth, like, why didn't dolphins take over? Because if you were betting, you would have said dolphins should have taken over. Why did, like, apes, basically? Well, they had thumbs, and also he points out they could gather around a fire. And since they could gather around a fire, they could communicate and develop language, is his kind of idea, right? Well, language is the first step of abstraction. Then I think you look at Mary Douglas's book, How Institutions Think. You had this problem where which abstractions are authoritative to organize behavior. So then you made institutions to say which of those abstractions is authoritative. And then from that becomes the product of rationality, which is disembodied rationality, which then leads to things like power, like government power and the kings that David Hume talks about that can rule people from a distance. Then power and rationality, enlightenment moves toward technology. All of this makes technology possible, this disembodied. Now we're basically at the full saturation of this historical process of disembodiment that gave us the modern world, and you know, things like the coordination problem, von Mises and Hayek, technology, all of these things. This very technology by which we communicate around the world is thanks to this. But this very thing that was good is now, if you don't go back and negate the past, is the thing that will destroy you. Just like God without veiling, you know, just like God at the wrong order, right? If you don't take a good thing and rightly order the relation, of which requires a certain going to the past, you will be destroyed, right? And that is going to require, like, the thing that like, again, that I think we basically left behind under global pluralism was the social. If I'm looking at the 1820s, and then where you had basically trade routes, you had, you know, obviously you had the Silk Roads far beyond that, but it's important that the Silk Roads were trade routes, so economic things could mediate difference, right? And as the world is globalizing in the 18th century, we find difference really difficult, so then we let capital do it for us, right? So instead of having a social be the means by which we mediate difference, like you see in a Tocqueville with democracy, et cetera, so forth, we let economics do it for us, right? Because it was too difficult. And it was a very efficient mechanism of compression for a period of time to move. But now we're in the age where we have to reclaim the social. The ability to coordinate and navigate human relations voice to voice, unmediated. Not mediated through a good like economics, not mediated through a technology, but literally in terms of the raw human relationship. That's where the value and potential is, but that's also where the Lovecraft horror is, because it is so hard. So how do we condition ourselves to be capable to do that? Bringing in the body, things like voicecraft, owning the mystery, owning this in this profound humility of having to reclaim something that we can't do without friends, and really focusing on things like friendship and the skills of which make that possible, which is going to be tied to our ability, well, to deepen together, not just change subjects together. And I think there are emotional skills that come with that as well, because as you go deeper, it becomes anxious, it becomes difficult. So there's emotional training, body training, all sorts of different things, but those came to mind.
Just to check quickly, did we schedule for 90 or 2 hours?
I think we scheduled for 90, but I can go on for like, let's say 15 minutes more because I
Beautiful,
also want to
beautiful,
hear closing remarks from both of you.
Okay,
beautiful.
cool. Should we sort of go around once more then and just kind of start landing?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
sounds good.
nice. Yeah, I noticed two strong emotions in that, Daniel, for me. One was when you talked about the polymaths in the fields and doing botany. Part of that is I've recently started a garden. I've just moved house and I've got space for like a pretty decent sized garden now. And I've just been, there's like a deep kind of love that I'm feeling just participating in that. And what I'm noticing is a lot of the kind of metaphysical principles that I'm swimming in just come crashing down into my experience of these plants. And in a way, I feel kind of like an idiot, really, because I can see the plant in a way almost understands this more than I do. Not in an absolute sense, but there's a kind of humility that I feel relating to that. The other thing I felt was just when you were talking about friendship was a deep sadness. What kind of tragedy are we living in when people don't have friends? That sort of like that really that shakes me up when I hear that. Yeah, and I think like it's what is sad in that is, as I was saying, like with the plant, so much of this is so natural to us. So how alienated must we be such that we can't participate in friendship? It sort of feels like one of the most natural drives or desires or like yearnings of nature, which I think really illuminates just how boxed in we are, how narrow the frame is. How narrow is the frame that I can't follow my desire to commune with another?
Mm.
And who am I then? Like what kind of identity am I inhabiting? Am I like a machine or am I like a an amorphous kind of gaseous cloud? Like, you know, what kinds of things can't come into relationship like that? Yeah, and then I loved the just the how you were describing the encounter with the divine, or like how I was kind of relating to it as an encounter with potentiality itself or possibility, and the way that can radically inflate even just like money as potentiality, the way that warps the psyche in all kinds of weird ways. It's like it's kind of subtle because like it's just numbers in my bank account, but in reality, it's like this godlike grasp on the field of possibilities that I can just seemingly dip into at any moment. But I don't have the body to wield that. Like my body is like an infant compared to like, I don't know, like, I'm kind of wanting to invoke like the platonic here. And it's like, what does it mean if I'm like a little baby babbling, but I can just pull from the sky and like bring these monstrosities into the earth? And I sort of something I've been grappling with myself, and I really am kind of challenged by this at the moment is like this relationship between the up and out and the down and in. And I loved what you were saying, Simon. I'm wondering if it's something like there's like the metaphysics is in the potential up here, but it's like the wisdom is in the actuality of the cosmology. Like it's it's the instantiation through lots of time and relationship of those metaphysical principles. And it's almost like they gain something new. Or at least that's what I'm wondering. Like, is it that I can just source from the sky and be all-knowing? Or do I actually have to source from actuality to truly understand the place for those principles on planet Earth as the field of Gaia and as, yeah, go on, Simon. I see you nodding.
Beautiful. Yeah, no. That's I think the importance of embodiment, of the importance of incarnation is really the importance of being embedded in a living planet, because that is the thing that we're doing here. So we might have existence, we might have parallel lives, we might have past lives, how you want to call it, on different places, different planets. But if you're here, then it's all about bringing the information here, and embodying it. Because if we embody it, it's the planet embodying it, right? Because we're renting this thing. This is a ecosystemic interaction between a physical, physical growing planet and an energetic field, which we are an expression of. So it's, for me, it really comes down to that. And um, there were so many different metaphors and things that fell into place while listening to the both of you. And it's too much to go back on. I have to think with the I love the image of this moving past something and then having to revisit. It reminds me of, I think it's Marshall McLuhan. I think he said life is experienced by being in a car and only looking in the rearview mirror. And so that sort of fully rang true to me. It's like, wait, what did we just experience? And then it's like, yeah, you have to. So in that sense, maybe the human is also a species that's smeared across time. So parts of us are doing the work in the past, and parts of us are doing the work here, and parts of us are doing the work in the future. And to honor that as well. And what I would like to close on, for me, for this great fun conversation dialogue, if I'm thinking about the global human organism and how it's shaping and under what kind of conditions it's being, or what kind of conditions it's being shaped by, I have to think about these metamorphic processes that insects do quite well. And we often talk about the butterfly, so the caterpillar into the butterfly. And that one is so evocative, I think, because for a lot of species, I think the caterpillar has to turn into a metabolic soup, has to fully decontextualize, so in a sense die, and have this other blueprint or this other field projected on that soup in order for it to become a butterfly, right? It is too reductionistic, I think, to look at the global human species and say like, oh, each one of us is making that move, even though I do feel at some point or at some part that is true, but we're all turning into different butterflies. But in that sense, I'm thinking we're all turning into different organs of the butterfly, because the wings are important of the butterfly, the eyes are important, the antennas, each part of it is vital. What I was thinking about during this conversation, and this image kept coming back, I think the role of the polymath is sort of the phloem, the bloodstream of the butterfly, because the polymath will be able to converse with each organ and exchange nutrients between each organ. And that also lessens the pressure that we might place on, that we might place on everybody, because all humans are here to do different things. And I think, I truly believe that we sign our ticket here. We have a certain idea of what we want, what movie we want to watch when we incarnate. And so some people might want to just be botanists, and some people might just want to be truck drivers or want to experience a certain area of human experience, which is of vital importance for the flourishing of the whole thing.
Yeah.
But to be stuck in this decontextualized state, in this metamorphic field where the individual human feels atomized and isn't incorporated yet into new organs, I think these organs are being formed. And at the same time, these new structures, where probably the polymaths will have to swim through, are also being formed. So we're in this process of recontextualizing, but I think it's asynchronous as well, or it's not linear, the process of metamorphosis. So there are still parts of the caterpillar as the butterfly is emerging. And in cell biology, it's the case that the context of where a cell is or organized, or where a cell is, determines what type of cell it becomes. And so these contexts are arising, these new organs, these islands of coherence, which are also often used as a metaphor. And so the role of dialogue is this communication between all the parts of the organism. And I think the role of the polymath is to become capable of penetrating every organ in order to exchange the nutrients that it gets from another organ, and to allow this cross communication. And here I have to think about it. Often about social changes being talked, that you only need 3% of the population for a certain shift in consciousness. Well, you don't need a body to be 100% consisting of blood, right? So that's sort of my image. So a very rich conversation. Thanks to both of you, because it sparked a lot of new ideas and reignited some old ideas. So thank you.
It's been magnificent. I don't know where the time has gone, and that is a fantastic image. I strongly agree with that. And I think the blood flow with the polymath, that's exactly right. I think that's a very good way to look at it. I think it's also what needs to, in a sense, what needs to scale, because there's always that question of scaling, is kind of just the permission to be different. Like if you read poetry in your free, you don't need everyone to be a polymath. What you need is a culture that, in a sense, gives permission for different uses of free time, that does not have a certain ethic about how free time should be used, right? And also what you need to scale is a capacity to not be overwhelmed by difference to some notable degree. I think it's important to highlight those capacities, because when you start talking about scaling, there's a difference. If I would ask, can everyone like quantum mechanics? That seems very different from asking, can everyone be literate? These seem to be very different questions. And I think when we're asking something about, can we scale a different mode of consciousness to handle complexity, I do think we need to associate that more with literacy than, say, quantum mechanics. Because to me, that is getting at I sometimes like to say, qualitative capacity, a capacity of qualia in experience, right? And it seems wrong to say, even of course it's the case that not everyone is literate, but it seems wrong to outright say not everyone can be literate, right? Don't you feel uncomfortable saying that? Now, it feels okay to say not everyone's going to learn quantum mechanics, but if you say not everyone's going to be literate, that seems problematic, right? But why? Is because we recognize there's some sort of difference there, right? There's some sort of difference there, because literacy is almost more, literacy does not seem to be just information. It's some qualitative capacity, dare I say. It's some sort of capacity. Scaling capacities is a very different question from scaling a certain field of knowledge, like philosophy or quantum mechanics, right? And what seems to be the case is you need a certain spreading of a permission for difference, different uses of time, et cetera, so forth, which I think gets into modeling social infrastructure. That's a different topic, but there's something there that I think we've touched on. Permission to have different kinds of conversation is also critical for this, and a capacity to not be overwhelmed by difference. And then in the midst of that, there is a growth of polymaths or polymathic being to a certain critical mass of 3% or whatever that gets the blood flow going to then have more of these paradigmatic shifts that move us, say, toward a idea of translating the infinite versus consuming the finite into hell closed from the inside or different things. A few more thoughts, and I don't know what the time goes. As you were speaking, Tom, on gardening, I had a lovely chat with Layman Pascal on his book on Gurdjieff. And one of the things I get out of Gurdjieff is what we do with our body has a massive impact on the metaphors we use for our thinking. And as we learn from Lakoff on metaphors we live by, Hofstede, many others, metaphors are not decorations of thought. They frame our thought. They are way deeper than decoration. So if you never garden, then the metaphor of gardening is never at hand. And therefore you will use, let's say you do mechanics, the metaphor of an engine will be at hand. Well, then you're very likely to understand the economy and everything like an engine, right? This is where using your body to do different things like cooking and gardening and mechanics is really important, because each one of those, you absorb a metaphor that then you will use even if you don't realize it, right? So I like connecting the body with what is by which we select our metaphors, because I think it shows the line between the use of body and the use of thought. And there's that it's not so much, it seems like it's not so much that we have metaphors, it's more like metaphors have us. Just like, Jung says about ideas or whatever that Peterson will say. So it's really important that we do different things with our body, because that, without us even realizing, determines the range of metaphors we can use. And if we don't have many metaphors on hand, we will be narrow. It's basically inevitable, right? Also, too, critically, classically, there was this emphasis in Aquinas and others that analogy is like the height of human thought, the ability to use analogy. This whole conversation, we've alluded to this capacity of having a sense of multiple layers at the same time, right? This ability to see 1, 2, 3, 4, not just one, right? That is a very odd mental act. But analogy is kind of like that. When I say, oh, the garden is like the economy, I'm saying A is like B, which is training me to think according to multiple layers and see a connection between those that's kind of mysterious. Like when I say the economy is like a garden, doesn't that make sense to y'all? Why the heck does that make sense to y'all? That's really weird, and yet it does. And arguably, human intelligibility is primarily this ability to work on multiple layers. And what people like Aquinas suggest is if you don't train people in analogy, then they're not going to be able to operate according to multiple layers. They're going to actually primarily and habitually think according to a single layer and be narrow. And of course, if you use analogy, the modern world became very skeptical of analogy and metaphor. It became very skeptical of poetic language. It wanted very straight factual language, right? Well, that means we used a language, if you will, a tool of language that habituated us into the inability to occupy multiple layers at once. So we have not been able to think of parts and wholes as situations together dialectically. It's part or whole, and we haven't been able to do analogy. We really I don't think we understand when people like Aristotle and the classical, that when they're really emphasizing analogy is important, I don't think we fully grasp what they're getting at. They're getting at, if you can't do analogy, then you must be narrow. And if you are narrow, you're a corpse, ultimately. An analogy too, and then I'll close with this based on what Simon was saying. Again, I don't know what the time goes. It's been so much fun. Is analogy is a translation activity, right? There's a certain translation that has occurring. And Simon said something very important about the idea of the point is to kind of translate the transcendent into the embodiment, right? It's to translate the infinite into the finite, to make, dare I say, the infinite with the in parentheses, right? This kind of bothness, right? What's very interesting, we've also suggested that there is seemingly something lost if humans had telepathy versus language, right? If I just knew what you were trying to say and there was no struggle, there seems to be a problem, because it actually seems to be the case, and this would get into things like Zizek and the wired brain, and Cadell talks about this, very important. Human subjectivity is constituted by struggle. It is the struggle. So literally, telepathy would be the end of subjectivity, right? Because subjectivity emerges from a certain effort of translation, really, of trying to get what you are saying, right? Well, this, in language then, you have that struggle is isomorphic to the struggle of bringing the infinite into the finite as a whole, right? And it's actually the struggle, if you will, of the infinite coming into the finite, which is, dare I say, the point. Not just getting into the infinite, but the struggle of the infinite coming into the finite, right? I think this is really important because there is, the great Dr. Segal will talk about in Whitehead, where there's this notion that creativity is at the heart of like, is God. It's like the highest principle, right? Well, we can just take, well, you could even kind of, that is certainly, in my opinion, the story of even the Abrahamic religions, because there's this idea of how does God have a relation with the finite and not destroy it, right? It has to be through the struggle of history. So both a Whiteheadian conception of a creativity as an unfolding principle where the infinite is coming into the finite can mythologically also be seen as God has a problem, mainly God. God is his own problem, meaning literally God cannot make himself finite. Only through translation can God be finite, right? Because if God made himself, if God, as a theological point, if God literally made himself entirely finite right now, well, then there would be no God to translate, right? So it has to be a historic process. Do you understand what I'm saying? So the only possibility of the transcendent coming into the finite must be through a certain struggle, a certain processing, a certain translation. That is the only way that God can be finite and not cease being God. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, because the only way that God can be finite or any transcendent, obviously I'm using God as a placeholder for the notion of the transcendent. The only way the transcendent can enter the finite and still be transcended is through a process. Human subjectivity is that process. Human subjectivity is that work. Language is that work between people, and the way we treat language is how we condition one another in possible friendship for that work to then potentially spread to greater and greater scales across greater and greater global pluralism and diversity. And that is where rethinking what language is, as I believe Voicecraft is doing in a very important way, is precisely the social condition of spreading the translation work of the transcendent into the finite, because it's all about how much can you do that and how much can you spread it and create greater and greater social network effects. But that comes down, what's always very interesting, because I think it's proper, given the finite and the infinite being bound up, these extremely transcendent horizons ultimately always come down to basically a single finite notion that just contains it all, like that grain of sand you were saying, Tom. You see the ocean and it has the grain of sand of like, it all just comes down to, can we talk together? In that simple notion, in that simple idea, boom, the whole conversation can unfold. And that, I think, is proper. That is how it is supposed to be. These things that can actually spread have to ultimately be a simplicity that people can do and habituate them to, that makes them participating in the bigger thing that we've discovered, even if they never put the bigger things to words. Because words are at their best when we can use them and not know about the whole horizon in the background, and yet in their use still participate in that wider horizon. And learning to treat language in that way with one another through a certain orbiting that then can spread and change these different potentials without at the same time making everyone the same. The spread of a capacity is how you have a unity and harmony without having sameness, which is a faceness and flatness. That mean, that finding that sweet spot, if you will, is found in language, and it is found by bringing the whole body into it. And this conversation has been a wonderful example and opportunity to participate in that horizon. So thank you both.
Yeah, that was beautiful, Daniel. I won't say too much, but I will just give a closing thought. I experience dialogue as like a microcosm of that image you created, Simon, of the metamorphosis. It seems like dialogue proper or conversational alchemy is a process by which we together kind of melt down into the liminality, and then we kind of swim around in that, looking for those imaginal discs to give us that kind of virtual scaffolding by which we can come out the other side as something new. So I think that as we were saying, there are scales to that process. We're kind of undergoing it in every moment, but then it's also playing out in these more macroscopic ways. And I think getting those talking to each other is also part of the challenge. And just one other thing, I feel like I like the example of the quantum physics relative to being literate. I also feel like there's something about the nature of intelligence where there will be some analog to quantum physics that any human could participate in. So there's something about like we may break through into a new paradigm and accommodate a new frame, but the like wisdom at that level is translatable across different domains that we'll all have some kind of proclivity for. And then we're kind of drawing on the polymath to help disseminate the new patterning through the different mediums. And that, I guess that was kind of like going forward. I think this thing we're calling the polymath, and maybe there's a challenge in that the polymath is often thought of more as something working more up here. I'm sure there's many other names we could have for it, but seems like in that model, there'd be a lot of power in the polymath being the communicator between. And so I'd be interested down the line to maybe explore, like what goes into making sure that they're playing that role benevolently, or, even systemic constraints that can help that role come into being in the right way. But yeah, this has been extremely animated for me, and I just really loved being with you both. I think there was just so much rich imagery and concept and real dialogue, I guess. So thank you both.